On Tuesday, I made a comedy parody video in which President Semi-Animated Cadaver and Venal Houseplant Joe Biden proposed that it's impossible to know who might have left a bag of cocaine laying around in the West Wing because there's been all sorts of people through the White House the past couple weeks who might have forgot to take their nose candy with them on the way out. These things happen. Again, this was a comedy parody video in which I was saying the most absurd possible things I could think of in an attempt to make you fine people spew your beverages all over your computer screens. But since life always imitates art in Joe Biden's America, and since parody is nearly impossible anymore because real life is always more absurd than the fictional version, my little comedy joke is now the official White House version of events. The FBI, for their part, they say it's pretty much impossible to ever figure out who marched off without their Colombian marching powder, but they have promised a full and complete investigation that shouldn't take any more than 6 to 8 years, give or take. Now, if I was a police investigator and I was living in the year 1923 instead of 2023, and you asked me if there was any way to identify who left a plastic bag someplace, I probably would say something like, well, yeah, it's a pretty simple matter to lift fingerprints off a plastic bag. We've had that technology for years here in 1923. But today's FBI, the world's most prestigious law enforcement agency, with access to the whole smorgasbord of highly advanced 21st century investigative tools, they say it's well nigh impossible trying to figure out who left illegal narcotics in the most secure building on the face of the planet, where nobody can do anything without it being captured on at least half a dozen security cameras. And we know what all this adds up to, of course. This is the Joe Biden administration and their water-carrying lackey stooge douchebags in the fake news performance art community saying, yeah, it was Hunter, because of course it was Hunter. And let's just quickly go over the known facts so there's not any confusion. Fact number 1. Joe Biden has a degenerate crackhead son. Fact number 2, the degenerate crackhead son is at the White House pretty much on a daily basis. Fact number 3, a degenerate crackhead left his drugs laying around in the West Wing. And let's also read between the lines a little bit, because you have to. One has to do that in a world where the news business has ceased to exist. If this was somebody else's coke, if there was anybody else they could pin this on, whose name doesn't rhyme with Butterschneiden, that fact would already have been blasted out to the entire universe. Because whoever's coke it is, I guarantee you the Secret Service has video of them leaving it where they left it. Probably from a whole shitload of different angles. If it was anybody who isn't Joe Biden's degenerate crackhead son, that person would already, in all likelihood, be in jail. But what do we get instead? Just a lot of people shrugging their shoulders and throwing up their hands, saying, oh, beats me, could have been anybody. Oh well. You know, I bet the number of prostitutes and drug dealers who have been through the White House on Hunter Biden's account these last 2+ years would be sufficient to shock the conscience of anybody who possesses one. You know what, I'll go even farther than that. I bet Hunter Biden has ejaculated in more rooms in the White House than Bill Clinton has. But remember, guys, this is not a story about a 53-year-old degenerate crackhead and the morally bankrupt father who's been enabling his behavior for decades. No, it is a story about a father's love and a son's courageous, inspiring struggle against substance abuse. At least that's what CNN told me. Now, you might be asking yourself at this point, what's the big deal? Everybody knows the president's son is a degenerate crackhead. Why are they so desperate to not admit the coke belonged to him when it so clearly did? I'll tell you why that is. Because you remember that sweetheart golden parachute plea deal that Hunter copped to a few weeks back? Well, it is part of every such plea agreement that if you get caught in possession of illegal narcotics, then the deal's off and your ass is getting punished to the full extent of the law. So if I am the judge in that case, let's just say I am very, very interested in finding out who the owner of that cocaine is. From high atop the battlements of Castle Curmudgeon, where all abandoned narcotics become property of the proprietor if not claimed within 6 minutes. Good evening, Mr. and Mrs. America, and all ships at sea. Welcome to the program. I am your eponymous host and humble servant. And there was a scandal over in the UK earlier this year that you may recall hearing about. It had to do with some super duper woke Royal Air Force staff officer complaining to his superiors on email that he can't possibly fill all the slots he has to fill in the next flight school class because too damn many of these applicants are white dudes. How am I supposed to comply with all the woke diversity quotas when you keep sending me nothing but white dudes? What does this look like? Freaking Great Britain or something? There was a whole series of emails where this guy became more and more unhinged, just ranting and raving about how intolerable the RAF is when it's got such an insufferable number of white Englishmen in it. By the end, he was basically just spewing the most vulgar sort of racist trash that one can envisage. But eventually the emails were disclosed to the public under the UK's equivalent of the Freedom of Information Act. And as you might expect, the racist staff officer, he was drummed out of the service. What? He wasn't drummed out of the service? Well, surely he was at least reduced in rank, right? No? What punishment did he receive for spewing the most vile, hateful, racist abuse while acting as an official of the British government? Oh, right, I should have guessed. They sent him to diversity training. Sensitivity training, whatever they call it. You know, I can't help wondering what those classes look like, since these sorts of classes are normally all about promoting the irrational hatred of white people rather than ameliorating it. They probably had to change around the whole curriculum for this one guy. Ethnically speaking, despite the best efforts of the Tories and Labour alike, Great Britain remains 87% white, and the RAF has staff officers who simply cannot tolerate their pilot training classes being anything close to an accurate representation of the country's demographics. Because that is just not what diversity and inclusion are all about. Diversity and inclusion mean you have to exclude white people and elevate non-white people. Diversity and inclusion means you have to pretend a group that makes up 3% of your population really makes up 93% of your population. Diversity and inclusion means pretending your country is 87% black when it's really 87% white. Because it's all about representation, don't you know? So if your job is assigning pilot trainees to pilot training classes and they give you an 87% white pool of candidates from which to choose, well, obviously, it means you should start writing pissed off emails to your boss about how much you absolutely detest Caucasian people. Now, the RAF did wind up issuing an official apology for being an openly racist organization, but only after they got deservedly crushed in the court of public opinion for a good long time. And only after a lot of people pointed out, and quite correctly, that if the RAF had diversity and inclusion standards 80 years ago, British school children would be speaking German today and lovingly saluting the swastika banner each morning in class. If you're watching this channel, you don't need me to tell you that what RAF Fighter Command achieved in winning the Battle of Britain is something so great, my words can never possibly do it justice. So I shall let Sir Winston Churchill speak in my stead. Quote, "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few." Close quote. And he agonized over that line for hours. Probably because he knew what great historical significance was going to be attached to it. He was still bouncing alternate versions of that line off his driver as he was getting out of the car to go into Parliament and give the speech. But as he so often did, he got the damn thing exactly right. The men in the RAF in the Battle of Britain, they were comically outnumbered by their foe. They were badly undersupplied. They were lacking in logistical support. There was absolutely no sane reason why they should have been able to turn back the Luftwaffe. But turn them back they did. And there was no man who stood taller in that heroic effort than a little bald man with no legs, named Group Captain Sir Douglas Robert Stewart Botter. CBE, DSO and bar, DFC and bar, DL, FRAS. And you know you're a high-achieving British citizen when your post-nominal letters take longer to read out than your actual name does. And just to whet your appetite a little, winning the Battle of Britain with no damn legs was probably the least interesting thing Sir Douglas Botter did during the war. Douglas Botter was born 21 February 1910 in St. John's Wood, London, the second son of Major Frederick Roberts Botter, a career army officer and civil engineer, wounded in action on the Western Front in 1917 while serving in the Royal Engineers, never fully recovered from his wounds, died in 1922 when little Douglas was a boy of 12. His mother quickly remarries and begins a family with her new husband, and she sort of loses interest in her two existing sons, so Douglas spends much of his childhood bouncing around living with various grandparents and aunts and uncles and so forth. By the time he enters prep school, he's earned a reputation as a top athlete, an inveterate practical joker, and a fairly underwhelming academic achiever who consistently ranks near the bottom of his class in every quantifiable metric of scholastic performance. Now, when you're the son of a military man in Britain in the 1920s, you're expected to follow your old man into that same line of work. And it's no different with Douglas Bader, but the Army doesn't sound to him like a very exciting prospect, especially when there's this brand new service branch called the Royal Air Force, which has only just recently been broken off from the Army and renamed from the Royal Flying Corps. For Douglas Bader, a young man who's a confirmed daredevil and risk-taker and athletic aficionado, a career spent cheating death every day, flying rickety wood and canvas biplanes with 96 horsepower engines that might explode or fall apart at any given moment, when they don't even let you wear a parachute because we can't have chaps jumping out of airplane we might be able to salvage. Well, that sounds like a hell of a fun career indeed. He joins the RAF as an officer cadet in 1928, and before he's matriculated from Royal Air Force College Cranwell into the active service, he's already been reprimanded repeatedly and nearly thrown out altogether for habitually engaging in pretty much every form of dangerous extracurricular activity that officer cadets are not supposed to engage in. But he manages to just barely graduate by the skin of his teeth, finishing true to form 19th out of 21 in his class. He receives his officer's commission on 26 July 1930, whereupon he is assigned to number 23 Squadron, where he flies Gloucester Gamecocks and Bristol Bulldogs, an alliterative airplane. He quickly developed a reputation, because of course he does, as a daredevil pilot who's always more than willing to risk life and limb to give the chaps on the ground a bit of entertainment. The RAF has very strong prohibitions against any sort of stunt flying or recreational aerobatics, but Bader sees these more as guidelines to be ignored rather than orders to be followed. And one of the hardest and fastest of those rules was, you don't do any damn unauthorized stunt flying below 2,000 feet. And why was that rule enforced so stringently? Well, Douglas Bader found out the answer to that question on 14 December 1931 at the Reading Aero Club, where he and his wingman had stopped by for a spot of tea on their way back to base. Some new acquaintances of theirs said they'd really enjoy seeing him do some of the daredevil low-level acrobatics for which he had already become widely renowned. So as was his habit, he says, "Sure, okay. No need to twist old Dougie's arm." He climbs into his Bulldog Mark IIA, does his usual daredevil aerobatic routine, gets a little too cocky right at the end, clips a wingtip on the ground, and promptly crashes and burns. He's pulled from the twisted wreckage before he has the chance to be burned alive, and when he wakes up in the hospital a couple of days later, the doctor says, "Pilot Officer Bader, I've got good news and bad news. The good news is, you are not dead. Bad news is, you got no damn legs. We had to take the left one off above the knee and the right one below the knee." Now this is the point at which most young men might say, well, I guess my career as a pilot is well and truly over now, but alas, most young men are not Douglas Bader. By the end of 1932, so within less than a calendar year of his crash, he's been fitted with a set of prosthetic legs, and he can walk so effortlessly in them that it's difficult to tell he's a double amputee. But he's not satisfied with that, so he takes up golf and ballroom dancing and becomes highly adroit at both things to the point of regularly entering and winning competitions where all the other competitors still have their legs. Despite all this, the RAF trenchantly refuses to return him to active duty, much less to flight status, so over his own strident objections, he's invalided out of the service in April of 1933 and takes a job with the Asiatic Petroleum Company, now better known as Shell. And I think you probably know where the story is heading now. By the late 30s, everybody not named Neville Chamberlain can see that there's very likely to be another European war, that air power may very well be the determiner of who wins and loses, and the RAF would do well to start being a hell of a lot less picky about whom they allow in the cockpit. Badr, as you can imagine, he starts firing off letters to the Air Ministry in 1937 saying, okay, boys, time's a-wasting. You and I both know that I'm coming back. You can save yourself a hell of a lot more letters by just learning to accept it. Even still, it takes until after the outbreak of the war in the middle of October 1939, and a hell of a lot more obnoxious letters, before they finally grudgingly invite him to come out for a check ride, and though he never realized it up until now, he finds that missing his legs actually gives him a tremendous physiological advantage over the other fighter pilots. He could do maneuvers that other guys couldn't do without getting tunnel vision and blacking out, because most of the battle of retaining consciousness as a fighter pilot during maneuvers is about trying to prevent your blood supply from running out of your brain down into your legs and feet. When you don't have any legs and feet, well, that's a hell of a big thing you never have to worry about. What's more, he found it far less physically taxing to work the rudder pedals with his fake wooden legs than he ever did with his real legs. So far from having all the disadvantages of a cripple, this guy basically had all the advantages of a robot man instead. By January of 1940, about half a year before the Battle of Britain kicks off, the RAF brass has gotten over any concerns they once had about using a legless man as a fighter pilot, and Badr is qualified to fly Hurricanes and Spitfires. He sees combat for the first time during the Dunkirk evacuation on the 1st of June and scores 2 kills in his very first engagement, a Messerschmitt Bf-109 and a Bf-110. By the start of the Battle of Britain in the middle of July, he's already an ace, flying primarily Hurricanes, occasionally Spitfires. By the end of the Battle of Britain, he's a double ace. He's been awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross, and they promote him all the way to wing leader, after which he exclusively flies Spitfires for the remainder of, I won't say the remainder of the war, the remainder of his part in the war. By the end of 1941, he's a quadruple ace with 20 confirmed kills, and bear in mind, the RAF is still operating out of southern England and doing all of its fighting over German-occupied France, so this is as hostile as territory gets for fighter pilots. You're basically taking fire from the air and from the ground at all times. Now, Badr flies out what turns out to be his last combat mission on 9 August 1941. He's at the head of a 4-man flight. They get jumped by a group of 12 Bf-109s. In the act of evading the initial onslaught, Badr gets separated from his companions and finds himself all by his lonesome facing half a dozen of the enemy, 2 of whom he manages to shoot down before being shot down himself, which leaves his final tally at 22 confirmed solo kills. So imagine how staggeringly high that number might otherwise have been had he been active for he missed the last 4 years of the war. He bails out over the Pas de Calais, is promptly captured by the Germans, who treat him with such an abundance of respect that he actually finds it rather embarrassing. He winds up spending most of the remainder of the war locked up in the infamous Colditz Castle, where only the highest value prisoners were kept, usually people who were well above the rank of group captain. Now, how much did the Germans respect Douglas Bader? Well, check this out. When he was bailing out of his Spitfire, one of his false legs got tangled up in the cockpit, and he had to detach it in order to be able to finish his bailout. And so, thus, he lands and is taken into custody with only one leg. General Adolf Galland, who's a noted World War I flying ace and also a local Luftwaffe commander, and a friend of Bader's, they had known each other between the wars. He passes a message to the British through the Swiss embassy saying British personnel will be given safe passage to and from the area if they want to come and bring Bader a new prosthetic leg. Reichsmarshal Hermann Goering himself authorizes the operation to go ahead, and on 19 August, barely just a couple weeks after he's shot down, an RAF Bristol Blenheim, another alliterative aircraft, flies to a determined set of coordinates and drops Bader's new right leg by parachute down to a waiting group of Luftwaffe personnel. And isn't war such a funny thing sometimes? It is characterized by killing and bloodshed and brutality and suffering, but every so often, out of the blue, you get a touching story about our common humanity and being nice to handicapped people. After being liberated and going home at the end of the war, all 3 of the British political parties were very desirous that Bader stand for election as a member of their faction, but he wound up telling them all to fuck off. In the end, he decided to go back and work for Shell again, on the basis that they had been willing to take a chance on him back when he was a 23-year-old cripple with nothing else to do. and he owed them a favor in return. And part of his employment contract was that he got to have a company plane and fly himself to all his work engagements, because of course it was. He retires from Shell in 1975. He's knighted by the Queen in 1976. He writes his memoirs. He lives to see the movie of his life story win the BAFTA Award for Best Picture. And he kept flying all the way until his doctors made him stop at age 70. He passes away on 5 September 1982, age 72 years, 7 months. Not bad for an annoying white guy with no damn legs, wouldn't you say? Thanks very much indeed for watching. Have a great day and a pleasant tomorrow. I will see you next time. Do not comply. Get off my lawn!